Picture a wrestling akhada on the outskirts of a dusty Haryana town at 5 in the morning. A pit of soft, oiled mud, teenage boys and girls already drilling takedowns before school. A framed photo of Hanuman watching from the wall. Now picture 20 kilometers away a glass and steel Gurugram tower where a 26-year-old is closing a Series B funding round with a venture fund in San Francisco. Time zone gymnastics and all. Both of those are Haryana on the same afternoon, sometimes in the same family. This is a state that produces more Olympic wrestling medals than entire countries and also builds a shocking share of India's cars. And it does both while, more than almost anywhere else in India, refusing to let go of some deeply old, deeply rigid ideas about who gets to make their own choices. Welcome back to Around India in half an hour. I'm Ray, and today we are in Haryana, episode 8, and honestly, one of the harder states to sum up neatly because it contradicts itself constantly. This is the state where the Bhagavad Gita was supposedly first spoken, where three of the most consequential battles in Indian history were fought at a single town called Panipat, and where a 5,000-year-old Harappan city sat quietly under a village until archaeologists dug it up. It's also right now one of India's wealthiest states per capita and one of its most industrially aggressive. And it's dealing with a sex ratio problem that a decade of government campaigns hasn't managed to fix. Let's get all of it. Haryana is small by Indian standards, about 44,200 square kilometers, roughly the size of Denmark, tucked into the northwest and wrapped almost entirely around Delhi, which it borders on three sides. If you've ever flown into Delhi, you've flown over Haryana without necessarily knowing it. Geographically, this is mostly flat, and the flatness matters more than it sounds like it should. Around 88% of the state sits in the Yamuna Ghaggar alluvial plain, gently sloping, dead flat, and extraordinarily fertile. This is prime green revolution country, land engineered over decades for maximum grain output. In the far northeast, the Shivalik hills, low, young foothills of the Himalayas, give the only real relief, and in the south, the tail end of the Aravalli range creeps in from Rajasthan, ancient, worn down hills that are actually some of the oldest fold mountains on the planet, older than the Himalayas by a wide margin, even though today they barely rise a few hundred meters. The Yamuna forms Haryana's entire eastern border and is its only perennial river. Everything else, including the Ghaggar, which is genuinely fascinating case, runs seasonal. The Ghaggar swells dramatically during monsoon and then all but vanishes for the rest of the year. And many geologists and archaeologists believe it's what remains of the mythical, long vanished Saraswati River that the Rig Veda talks about constantly. Whether or not you buy into that identification exactly, the paleo channels of an ancient, much bigger river system genuinely do run through this landscape. And they're part of why this particular strip of land has been continuously farmed and settled for thousands of years. Climatically, Haryana runs to extremes that would break most people. Summer highs hitting 50 degrees Celsius in places like Hisar, winter lows dropping close to freezing. There's very little forest cover left. Centuries of intensive agriculture and, more recently, industrial and urban expansion have stripped most of the natural vegetation down to scrub. and planted eucalyptus lining the highways. The southwest edges into semi-desert, sand dunes creeping in from the Thar, which is a genuinely strange thing to encounter an hour or two outside Gurgaon's skyscrapers. Haryana borders Punjab and Himachal Pradesh to the north, Uttar Pradesh across the Yamuna to the east, Rajasthan along its west and south, and it completely surrounds Delhi on three sides, north, west, and south, with only Uttar Pradesh touching the capital's remaining edge. That geography is basically Haryana's whole modern economic story in one sentence. This state functions in large part as Delhi's overflow valve. Gurgaon and Faridabad exist the way they do specifically because Delhi ran out of room and Haryana was right there. Historically, this same location, the direct land approach to Delhi from the northwest, made Haryana the single most fought over stretch of ground in South Asian history. Every invading army moving toward the seat of imperial power in Delhi had to overcome through here first. And more than once, the outcome of the entire subcontinent's political future got decided on this flat, unremarkable plain rather than in Delhi itself. Start about 7,000 years ago, because that's genuinely how far back the history of Haryana goes. Bir Rana, in Haryana's Fatehabad district, has produced radiocarbon dates stretching back to roughly 7500 BCE, making it one of the earliest known settled village sites anywhere in South Asia, predating the classic Indus Valley sites by millennia. And in Hisar district, the village of Rakhigadi sits on top of what turned out to be the largest Harappan era Indus Valley civilization site ever discovered, bigger than Mohenjo-daro. Five interconnected mounds, paved streets, drainage systems, jewelry workshops, and a cemetery whose skeletons underwent DNA analysis that produced a genuinely important finding. The ancient population here shows continuity with modern South Asians and no significant genetic signature from the later steppe migrations that brought Indo European languages into the subcontinent. That's a real scientific data point in an argument that's often more political than archaeological. The question of who the Aryans were and whether they migrated in or were indigenous. And Rakhigari's DNA evidence complicates the simple migration story in ways that are still being argued over by serious researchers, not just ideologues. By around 1500 to 500 BCE, this region, sometimes called the Brahmavarta or Aryavarta in later texts, was the heartland of Vedic civilization. The Kuru kingdom specifically centered on Kurukshetra. This is where the hymns of the Rig Veda were composed and compiled, where fire altar rituals were performed on an industrial scale, and where the religious and philosophical vocabulary that would eventually become Hinduism first took shape. And it's where, according to the Mahabharata, the 18-day war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas took place, the single most consequential story in Hindu epic literature, with Krishna delivering the Bhagavad Gita to Arjun on the battlefield at a spot called Jyotisar, right before the fighting started. Archaeology confirms Vedic era settlement and ritual activity around Kurukshetra in roughly the relevant period. The specific details of the war itself come from epic literature, composed and elaborated over centuries rather than a historical record. For millions of visitors, the site's religious and cultural significance today doesn't depend on resolving that distinction. Move forward past the Mauryas and Guptas, past a real verifiable king Harshavardhana, who ruled a substantial North Indian empire from Thanesar near Kurukshetra in the 7th century AD, and you get to the era this region is honestly most remembered for by most Indians, Panipat. Three separate, genuinely history altering battles were fought at this one remarkable town, roughly 30 years and then 200 years apart. In 1526, Babur defeated the last Lodi Sultan and effectively founded the Mughal Empire. In 1556, Akbar's forces defeated Himu, a remarkable low caste grain merchant turned military commander who had briefly taken Delhi and crowned himself king and secured Mughal rule for the next 2 centuries. And in 1761, the Marathas, who by that point had controlled most of North India, were catastrophically defeated by the Afghan ruler Ahmad Shah Durrani. A battle so bloody it's still cited as one of the largest single day death tolls in 18th century warfare anywhere in the world, and one that arguably opened the door for British to eventually fill the power vacuum the Marathas left behind. Three battles, one small town, and each time the entire trajectory of the subcontinent bent because of what happened on that particular stretch of flat ground. Under British rule, this region was folded into the much larger Punjab province, administered from Lahore, and it stayed that way through independence and partition, which hit this area hard, given how close it sits to the new India Pakistan border and how much cross border displacement and violence rippled through Punjab in 1947. Haryana only became its own state on November 1st, 1966, carved out of Punjab specifically along linguistic lines, separating Hindi speaking Haryanvi areas from Punjabi speaking ones. With the new city of Chandigarh awkwardly shared as a joint capital between the two states, an arrangement that 6 decades later both sides still occasionally squabble over. What happened after 1966 is arguably the most important economic story. Haryana, alongside Punjab, became the absolute epicenter of India's Green Revolution starting in the late 1960s. Heavy investment in irrigation, high yield seed varieties, and fertilizer that transformed India from a food aid dependent country into a grain surplus one within about a decade. That transformation built modern Haryana's wealth, but it also built modern Haryana's water problem because decades of intensive water hungry wheat and rice cultivation have drawn down groundwater tables across the state to genuinely alarming levels. A slow motion crisis that doesn't get nearly the same attention as the original Green Revolution success story did. Wait, state, not country, but you get the instinct. Because Haryana genuinely behaves like it's punching in a different weight class. Population sits around 30 million. Gurgaon, now officially Gurugram, has become one of India's most important financial and IT hubs, hosting offices for well over 200 Fortune 500 companies in a skyline that 25 years ago was mostly farmland. Faridabad is a major industrial center too, and together with Gurgaon, it forms part of the National Capital Region's economic engine. Economically, this is generally one of India's strongest states by most per capita measures. And the current state government under Chief Minister Nayab Singh Saini is leaning hard into that momentum. The 2026-27 state budget, presented in mid 2026, runs to roughly 223,000 crore rupees with a stated ambition of making Haryana a $1 trillion contributor to India's economy by 2047, alongside a specific push into AI training programs, industrial land development, and incentives for local hiring. But, and this is the part that genuinely needs saying plainly rather than glossed over, Haryana has also one of India's most skewed sex ratios, and it's not improving. The 2011 census put Haryana's sex ratio at birth among the worst of any major Indian state, sparking the national Beti Bachao Beti Padhao, Save the Daughter, Educate the Daughter campaign, which Prime Minister Narendra Modi actually launched from Panipat in January 2015, specifically because Haryana was the emblem of that problem. There was real, measurable improvement through the later 2010s, but State Health Department data from the first 4 months of 2026 shows the sex ratio at birth has slid backward again, down to roughly 898 girls per 1,000 boys, prompting the state government to start enlisting Hindu priests, Muslim clerics, and Sikh granthis to counsel newlyweds against sex selective abortion. Because a decade of administrative campaigns clearly hasn't been enough on its own. A related, well documented feature of rural Haryana is the continued social authority of Khap panchayats, informal caste and clan councils that, among other functions, enforce rules against intercaste or same gotra marriage. Human rights groups and courts in India have documented cases where Khap panchayats sanctioned or incited violence, including so called honor killings, against couples who married against family wishes. And India courts have reportedly ruled against Khap panchayats overriding individuals' legal right to choose their own spouse. Female literacy in the state has been rising, and Haryanvi women, including several of the wrestlers we'll cover shortly, have been increasingly visible voices in public debates about these issues. Let's meet some of the remarkable people from Haryana. Start with Neeraj Chopra from Khandra village in Panipat district, who won India's first ever Olympic gold medal in athletics at the Tokyo 2020 Games in the javelin throw, a genuinely historic moment for Indian sport, given that India, with a population of over a billion, had gone its entire Olympic history without an individual track and field gold before Chopra threw 87.58 meters in Tokyo. Then there's Sushil Kumar, whose 2008 Beijing bronze in wrestling is often credited with kicking off Haryana's modern wrestling boom, followed by a 2012 London silver that made him the first Indian to win two Olympic individual medals in any sport. In 2021, Kumar was arrested in connection with a fatal altercation at a Delhi stadium, and he was later convicted in that case, a development that has shaped how his legacy is discussed in India today. The Phogat sisters, Geeta, Babita, Vinesh, and their cousins, Ritu and Priyanka, trained by their father, Mahavir Singh Phogat, in a village akhada starting in the late 1990s, became the most visible symbol of Haryanvi women breaking into a sport that had, until then, been an almost exclusively male domain. Their story became the basis for the Bollywood film Dangal. Vinesh Phogat's own Olympic career ended in genuine heartbreak at Paris 2024, disqualified from the gold medal final for being 100 grams over her weight class the morning of the bout. But she'd already spent the previous year as one of the public faces of a protest movement by India's top wrestlers accusing the head of the Wrestling Federation of India of sustained sexual harassment. A protest that again was led overwhelmingly by Haryanvi women wrestlers, willing to put their careers on the line in a state where speaking out against powerful men is genuinely not a small thing to do. And going back further, Himu, properly Hemchandra Vikramaditya, deserves a mention most people outside India have never heard. A grain trader by birth, from a low Hindu merchant caste, who rose through sheer military skill to briefly seize Delhi and crown himself emperor in 1556 before losing everything at the Second Battle of Panipat weeks later. It is one of Indian history's great almost stories. Haryana calls itself, without much modesty, the land of rotis. And the food here is built almost entirely on wheat, millet, dairy, and whatever vegetables the season provides. Simple, filling, farmers' food rather than elaborately spiced Mughlai cooking you would find further into North India's royal kitchen traditions. Bajra khichdi is close to the state's signature dish. Pearl millet soaked overnight, cooked down with moong dal into a soft, unshowy porridge, seasoned with barely more than cumin and a little turmeric, and finished with a gorgeous spoon of homemade ghee, then eaten with buttermilk or curd. It's genuinely humble food, and Haryanvis will tell you that's exactly the point. Kadi pakoda, gram flour fritters simmered in a tangy spiced buttermilk and besan curry, shows up on nearly every table alongside besan masala roti and the plainer, everyday bajra roti, eaten with fresh butter or raita. Bathua raita, made with the leafy green bathua folded into spiced yogurt, is a winter sample, and kachri chutney, made from a small wild desert cucumber that grows locally, gives a distinctly regional sour kick you won't find in neighboring states' cooking. Dairy is the real backbone here, though more than any single dish. Haryana is home to the Murrah buffalo, prized across India for its exceptionally high milk yield, and the state's per capita milk production is among the highest in the country. Fresh butter, churned daily at home and called nooni or tindi ghee, is treated almost ceremonially. It's traditionally part of the gift package given to a new mother alongside laddus and dried fruit. For dessert, look for malpua served with rabdi or alsi ki pinni, a dense, nutrient-packed winter sweet made from flaxseed, wheat flour, and ghee that's specifically eaten to get through the cold months. Kurukshetra is the obvious starting point. Brahma Sarovar, an enormous sacred tank where pilgrims bathe, particularly during Gita Jayanti celebrations, and Jyotisar, marked today by a large banyan tree set to sit on the exact spot where Krishna spoke the Gita to Arjuna. Whatever your relationship to the theology, the site carries genuine weight for millions of visitors every year. Rakhi Gadi, out in Hisar district, is for a different kind of traveler entirely, an actual walkable Indus Valley civilization site with an on-site museum, though it's worth knowing going in that conversation has been ongoing challenge. Parts of the site have dealt with encroachment and cattle grazing despite its scale and archaeological importance. And the Haryana government has more recently begun investing in a dedicated site museum and better protection. Panipat's three battlefields don't offer much in the way of dramatic ruins, but the historical weight of standing on ground where the fate of empires was decided three separate times is hard to shake. The city is also worth a stop for a completely different reason. It's known as India's cast off capital, a massive global center for recycling used textiles, which tells you something about how modern Haryana's industrial identity sits right alongside its ancient one. and Gurugram itself, for all its traffic and construction site chaos, is worth including simply because it is the story of contemporary Haryana. Glass towers, malls, and a startup scene that would have been unthinkable on the same farmland a generation ago. Sultanpur National Park nearby, meanwhile, offers something Gurugram's skyline can't: genuinely excellent migratory bird watching in a wetland that somehow survives right next to one of India's fastest growing cities. Haryana uses the Indian rupee, currently trading around 95 to 96 rupees to the US dollar. Worth checking a live rate before you travel, as always. The state's economy runs on three main legs: agriculture, still central to identity, even as its share of GDP shrinks, heavy industry, and automobile manufacturing, with Maruti Suzuki and Hero Motorcorp both headquartered in the state and together accounting for a huge share of India's overall vehicle production. And increasingly, the Gurugram centered IT, finance, and startup economy that's grown explosively over the past 2 decades. The 2026-27 state budget at roughly 223,658 crore rupees is up over 10% from the previous year, with the government explicitly targeting AI skilling programs, 10 new industrial model townships, and a headline goal of turning Haryana into a $1 trillion economy contributor to the national economy by 2047. It's an ambitious target for a state that, at independence, was mostly considered unremarkable farmland on the way to somewhere else. Within India, Haryana is famous in roughly descending order: for wrestling, for Panipat's three battles, for being the site of the Bhagavad Gita's telling at Kurukshetra, and for cars. Maruti Suzuki's dominance of the Indian car market is genuinely tied to this one state's factories. Internationally, almost none of that registers. Outside India, if Haryana is known at all, it's usually filtered through Gurgaon's tech and outsourcing economy, or through the Bollywood film Dangal, which introduced a global audience to the wrestling village culture that most Indians already knew well. Haryanvi folk music runs on ragini, a distinctive, often narrative driven folk singing style traditionally performed at village gatherings and festivals, frequently telling stories with clear moral or devotional themes, sometimes performed as an actual back and forth debate between two singers. The dhol and the folk fiddle, called sarangi, both feature heavily, and traditional Haryanvi folk dances like the ghumar and the phag dance are tied closely to harvest and seasonal festivals. Architecturally, Haryana doesn't have the palace and fort grandeur of nearby Rajasthan, but Kurukshetra's temple complexes and the newer, deliberately grand Gita Gyan Sansthanam Institute reflect a state that's invested heavily in building up its religious tourism infrastructure around the Mahabharata connection. In cinema, Haryana's most significant recent contribution has been supplying the raw material rather than the industry itself. Dangal and Sultan, two of the biggest Hindi films of the past decade, are both built on real Haryanvi wrestling stories, evidence that this state's culture has become genuinely marketable to a national audience in a way it wasn't a generation ago. This is where Haryana genuinely stands apart from every other state in India, and it's not close. Wrestling here isn't a hobby, it's closer to an institution built around village akhadas, mud wrestling pits attached to boarding facilities where young wrestlers, historically almost all male, train from childhood. For the last several Olympic cycles running, India's individual wrestling medals have come overwhelmingly from Haryana born athletes. Sushil Kumar in 2008 and 2012, Yogeshwar Dutt in 2012, Sakshi Malik in 2016, Ravi Kumar Dahiya, and Bajrang Punia in 2020. Given the state holds well under 3% of India's population, that concentration of Olympic medals is genuinely extraordinary, and it's rooted in decades of infrastructure. Those akhadas that most of India simply doesn't have. Boxing has its own strong tradition too, centered on the Bhiwani Boxing Club, which has produced a steady pipeline of national and Olympic level fighters, including Vijender Singh's 2008 Beijing bronze. Shooting is a newer growth area, with Manu Bhakar among the state's rising stars. And then there's Neeraj Chopra's javelin gold, which arguably did more to put Haryana's sporting culture on a global map than anything wrestling had managed, simply because track and field carries more international visibility than wrestling does. What ties all of it together is genuinely serious state level sports infrastructure and, frankly, a culture that treats athletic achievement as a viable and respected path out of village life, which matters enormously in a state where land holdings keep shrinking with every generation of inheritance. Many Indians from outside Haryana associate the state with a fairly narrow set of images: wrestlers, dairy farmers, khap panchayats, and a record on gender ratio and caste related issues that national data generally bears out. That image often overlooks the pace of Gurgaon's economic transformation, the depth of the state's sporting infrastructure, and how old this land actually is. Few people realize that some of the earliest known village settlements in South Asia and the largest Harappan city site ever found both sit inside Haryana's borders. Less widely recognized nationally is that Haryana has built one of India's most significant automobile manufacturing bases, and its dairy sector supplies a large share of North India's milk. On gender ratio specifically, Haryana remains the focus of sustained government attention. The National Beti Bachao Beti Padhao campaign launched here in 2014 for that reason, and the data of 2026 showing renewed decline suggests the underlying social attitudes will likely take longer to shift than any single policy campaign. So that's Haryana, a small flat piece of land that's hosted decisive battles, produced a striking share of India's Olympic wrestlers, and built a large part of India's automobile industry, while also facing some of the country's most persistent gender ratio and caste related social challenges. Both the achievements and the challenges are part of the same state, often visible in the same villages and even the same families, and both continue to shape how Haryana sees itself heading into 2026 and beyond. Next time, we head to my state, Karnataka. Coffee, Bangalore's tech boom, and a very different kind of state altogether. Thanks for listening to Around India in half an hour. If this one gave you something to think about, follow the show and leave a review. It genuinely helps. See you next Tuesday.